Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Dauphinais. And today I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Gerald Boersma, Associate Professor of Theology at Ave Maria University and a good friend and colleague.
I'm delighted to be here, Michael. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Well, thanks, Gerald, for being here. And today we're really excited to kind of dive into the thought of one of the great theologians, the great doctors, the great father of the church, St. Augustine of Hippo. And it's hard to probably over-exaggerate Augustine's influence on really the way that we have articulated the biblical revelation, right? Especially in the West. And so I just think it's a wonderful time to kind of get to know Augustine, to get to know his teaching. And, you know, it's for listeners who may not know, right? You've been studying Augustine, I think, off and on for over 15 years, and published, now getting ready to publish almost several books on Augustine and countless articles. So it's a wonderful opportunity for listeners and viewers to be able to kind of get a little sneak peek into your course that you also teach on Augustine for our students. So one thing I wanted to just ask you a little bit about is, you know, what about people that kind of sometimes will often use the word Augustinian somehow as though it's like a pessimistic worldview? You know, Augustine teaches original sin. Augustine kind of teaches a negative outlook on, you know, humanity and these sorts of things. How would you respond to that?
Right. Well, I mean, Augustine, as you say at the outset, is a towering figure. Right? He has a kind of an immortal legacy, I think, apart from the Apostle Paul. It's hard to figure another person who's given such definitive shape to the way in which we think about our faith.
Yeah.
And so I think that initial staging should put the question in some perspective. If Augustine is pessimistic, then the Christian faith is pessimistic. And that is not the case at all.
Yeah.
I think if you look at Augustine's corpus as a whole, you see in countless places the kind of optimism, the joy, the hope that radiates from his theology. You have to remember that Augustine's first foray into the faith was in response to the Manicheans. And if there's anything that marked a Manichean, it was this indomitable pessimism, right?
Yeah.
And Augustine's optimism about grace, about the goodness of creation, about God's working in our souls to join us to himself, very much the opposite of the pessimistic vision of the world that you have from the Manicheans and their associates.
Yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful way of beginning. So let's maybe just talk a little bit about how did you set up the course on Augustine, right? Such a big figure. I think there was a line was it Isidore who said that anybody who claims to have read all of Augustine must be lying?
Right, exactly. So one has to be selective.
Exactly. So what were some of the big themes that you maybe wanted students to walk away with, or how did you think about what was the most important in trying to organize Augustine so that, you know, students would be able to learn?
I wanted to give students kind of exposure to the breadth of Augustine, but also kind of, you could say, his greatest hits.
Okay.
Right? So that students go away from the course having read, you could say, the big things in the Augustinian corpus. And in some sense, I structured the course chronologically. So first we started with his early works, and what's fascinating about Augustine's early works, some written before his baptism, in fact, and some after, is that they're all dialogues, right? So Augustine's first 8 works are exclusively dialogues, and then he moves away from that genre. He never again writes a dialogue. So that's in itself an interesting question. Why the dialogue? Why abandon the dialogue? Now what's going on in those early works, which I thought it would be so fascinating to spend some time there initially, is Augustine's engaging with his kind of philosophic legacy. You have to remember, Augustine's deeply learned in the Latin classics. You know, he's familiar with the rhetorical, grammatical, philosophic legacy. He's familiar certainly with people like Virgil and Cicero, but also Plutarch, Plotinus, Quintilian, Terence. And he's very much at home in that world, and now he's trying on his fledgling faith. And seeing how those two come together, right? His classical formation, both rhetorical and philosophic, and this faith that he's taking seriously intellectually for the first time, trying to give a reasoned account intellectually of the faith that he had kind of unreflexively taken from his mother, Monica, but now thinking about, right?
Yeah.
Can he reason about this? So that's fascinating, I think, and spending some time there in the early works. Again, 4 dialogues he writes before he goes down to Milan to be baptized, and then 4 works when he goes back to Africa before his ordination, and while still in Rome, about to sail for Africa.
Is there one dialogue of his early writings that you either particularly find kind of easy to teach, or maybe one that you just enjoy reading yourself?
Sure, yeah. One that I always gravitate towards, and both I enjoy teaching and I enjoy reading, is De Beata Vita, which is translated On the Happy Life.
Yeah.
Right? It's actually very similar to a title that Seneca has of one of his early dialogues. And in both cases, it's the quest for happiness, for flourishing, for fulfillment. And in the kind of heady maelstrom that's the kind of classical antiquity, all the different philosophic accounts share one common question, right? What makes for happiness? How are we to achieve flourishing, fulfillment? And, you have your Peripatetics, your Platonists, your Stoics, your Epicureans. And in that kind of heady maelstrom again, Augustine comes in and says, engaging with those figures, that only Christ and embracing the wisdom of Christ constitutes happiness. But what's so distinctive about that dialogue is that one of the central figures is his mother, Monica, right? Who speaks about her wisdom not from learning and study, but by a direct infused gift of the Holy Spirit, which allows her to make the decisive entry at critical points in that dialogue. So thinking about Monica very early in Augustine's writings and the way she kind of stays with him is a fascinating thing.
Right, she becomes a decisive figure in if you want to think about like the Platonic dialogues. Right. In the Augustinian dialogues, it's Monica who shows up to share wisdom.
Yeah. So you think of Diotima, for example, in the Symposium. Yeah. Well, Monica takes that place.
Okay.
In the Beata Vita.
Yeah, that's great. Can you how would you summarize his argument? Because I think Plato and Aristotle and Seneca, you mentioned a Stoic, right? In many ways, they say many true things about happiness.
Yeah.
Kind of true things about the happy life. What is it that Augustine finds kind of wanting in those accounts and then thinks that Christ supplies?
Right. Well, I think you really have to get into the weeds somewhat here in terms of, well, how do the Stoics think happiness comes to the human person? Well, it's especially through internal appropriation of virtue, right? Being able to show a sense of apatheia, not being affected or effected by external goods or external sorrows. And the opposite of the spectrum, you have the Epicureans, right? For whom all good is on the outside. You've maybe heard the, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Very much the kind of Epicurean maxim. And while the Peripatetics, Aristotle's school, said, well, it's a bit of both, right? You have to have the goods of the body, but in addition, you have to have internal virtue. That's kind of we could say the ultimate source of happiness, but it's a happiness proper to man. A man has a body.
Sure,
so his friends, some wealth, some basic leisure to be able to pursue contemplative questions. Now, Augustine notes all these various schools consist of happiness in this life, right? Either externally or internally or a combination thereof. No, says Augustine, happiness is the preserve of the next life. And that's a mainstay in his writings. Already in De Beata Vita, which I mentioned, there Monica makes that decisive interjection that happiness is possessing Christ for all eternity. But very late in his life, in the City of God, in Book 19, that's ultimately where it ends up as well.
Yeah.
Right? Happiness consists ultimately in the vision of God given to Christ.
Right. Yeah, there is that somehow death must be overcome, that any happiness we have that would that would be in this life, right, would always be provisional.
Right.
And any kind of lasting happiness, right, would have to be somehow death has been overcome, right? Eternal life has been given.
Yeah.
We possess not only right, and in a way we have to possess, as you put it, not just eternal life though. It's not just though just life continues. We have to have a new life. We have to have a life where we would be able to know and love,
right,
the God who knows and loves us.
That's beautiful.
Right, in that sense that we actually, we have to get what we want. Right, but we have to want what is ultimately, right, God. And not just God abstractly, but the creator of the universe who is now incarnate
Right.
in Jesus Christ.
And it's that transformation, especially of our knowing and loving, that Augustine details in his kind of his own journey in the Confessions in such poignant personal ways.
Yeah, so maybe, having kind of looked a little bit at these early dialogues, why don't we talk a little bit about the Confessions, probably his best known work.
Right.
I think it's assigned, and I know we assign it at Ave Maria University in our core curriculum.
Right. Well, and many secular schools do as well.
And even secular schools do, absolutely. It's really one of these great works of Western culture. How do you try to introduce students to the Confessions?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the first place is, that it does have this kind of enduring character, that it's widely read, it continues to be widely read, continues to speak to people.
Yeah.
Right? And in that sense, it's a classic.
Yeah.
Right? And a classic is one of those texts that, you can continue as an individual to return to with profit. I've been teaching the Confessions for 15 years. I've read it for, many years.
Yeah.
And every semester, it kind of speaks to me in new ways. Something I didn't notice before arrests me. And what's true for the individual is also true for society, right?
Yeah.
Classics are those texts that they form a people. Homer does for the Greeks, or Virgil for the Latins, Dante for the Italians. Well, what the Confessions does is it writes a story for the Christian people, right? And Augustine's quite intentional about that when he writes the Confessions. He styles himself, the protagonist of the narrative, as the new Virgil, right? Who's also traveling about the Mediterranean orbit, also kind of not listening well, we might say, to the divine command. And then finally, he sets sail for Carthage, from Carthage to Rome, right?
Yeah.
And also leaves someone, weeping on the beach as he sets sail for Rome. So in many ways, that's one way to read the Confessions. It's kind of the Christian people's new epic.
Yeah. So just as say, right in Virgil's Aeneid, you have really the story of Aeneas and then the founding of Rome.
Right.
In the Confessions, you have Augustine telling the story of he's both Virgil and Aeneas. He's telling the story not of the founding of Rome, but in a way of the founding of, to a certain extent, the church that we live in.
That's exactly right.
Which is fascinating because if you think about it that way, then often if people are familiar with the Confessions, they may know that the first 9 chapters are kind of more fit within a more standard story autobiography. 10 is a little bit within that. And then by the time you get to 11, 12, and 13, the last 3 books, you're dealing with very complex matters of reading the Genesis.
That's right. That's
why
it's helpful, I think, always to start with the initial books. Because those are very personal.
Yeah.
Right? Although it's Augustine's own story, very personal, poignant tale of conversion, it's also an everyman tale, which is why I think it continues kind of echo in so many different people, and they can read it and relate to it. When you first read the Confessions, it's almost like you're listening in on someone in prayer, right? And that's why, we mentioned that the dialogues constitute Augustine's first writings. Well, in some sense, he never really abandons the genre. He puts it in a different way. It's a dialogue between himself and God.
You're right. Doesn't I don't know about in the Latin, but doesn't it begin with Augustine's Confessions? Doesn't it begin with "You, O Lord"?
Yeah, great are you, O Lord, and greatly to be praised.
Yeah.
Right? Again, that's not how most of us would start our own autobiography. We might speak about formative influences, our parents, our teachers, our hometown. Yeah. It's not there in Augustine. Right? Instead, what you get is Augustine at prayer. Right? And it's as if we're kind of walked in on him at prayer, intruding on in his bedroom as he's praying to God, right? Which gives it a real dynamism. Yeah. It's very authentic.
Yeah. And in a way, helping us when we kind of watch Augustine narrate his life, it's almost in the second person, right? It's not in the first person, it's in the second. He's always kind of writing it to you, O Lord. Right. That we begin then to realize I have to learn to be able to to understand who I am.
Right.
It's fundamentally, who are you, Lord? You created me. Right? I walked away from you.
Right.
Right. You brought me back.
Yeah.
Right. And it's really very, educative in that way. And in a strange way, I don't know if you ever have this experience when you're reading great novels or great epics or great stories, you kind of wish you could live in those stories.
Right.
This is something that Gerald J.R.R. Tolkien writes about on fairy stories. He says, we wish we could live in stories. We wish we could live in great fairy tales. But in a certain sense, when you read the Confessions, in a way, you can't enter into the, kind of Augustine's life in the 4th century. But in another way, you can, because we can actually carry out the exact story that Augustine has when we begin to narrate our lives as this kind of heroic journey, both away from God and then the return to God.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about how, he begins to, how he talks about his own, wandering away from God? Because I think that does play a big role in the first half of the Confessions.
Right. And the word wandering is important there, right? He uses the word errores, where we get our English word error from.
Okay.
But that's above all the adjective that describes the Aeneas, right?
Oh, okay.
Aeneas is known for his wanderings. And so Augustine appropriates that word and gives it a certain theological spin, right? He is alienated, wandering from God, right? And the story of the Confessions is a story of conversion, or really multiple conversions, right? It's the way in which grace operates on his knowing and his loving, right? And all of that, I think, is already very tightly wound up in the very first paragraphs of the Confessions. And then the rest of the work kind of unfurls those kind of major themes. And so in Book 1, many of us have read it, you have the scene with Augustine first as an infant, right? And when you first read this, and my students first read it, they're often perplexed, right? You have this rather dour description of infant behavior, right? Thrashing violently, seeking to attack its mother, vengeful and jealous at its petty brother, drinking milk. But what Augustine is doing there is subtly, between the lines, telling us that there's something wrong with the will, right? That original sin affects the will, that we don't naturally and easily incline to the good, right? That the acquisition of virtue is difficult, that we're not born with kind of native reserves of virtue. And in the second half of Book 1, he turns to his boyhood at school. And there you turn from the will to the intellect, right? And that learning is difficult. Augustine says, I learn nothing unless compelled, right? You have to be beaten to learn, which, caused him great psychological angst, he tells us later. But again, the idea that we don't kind of jump into truth with great alacrity. That's hard work as well.
Yeah.
So, but there's something kind of wrong at the outset with our loving and our knowing, with our will and our intellect.
Yeah. I also try to remind students that infans means without speech.
Right.
So you have two big themes there. One is, we are without speech to speak to God and to speak to ourselves. And the whole Confessions is the learning to speak. Before we can learn to speak truthfully, right, which the creed gives us that ultimate truth. The problem is culture misshapes us into a misspoken speaking. So we learn to speak about God falsely. We learn to speak about ourselves falsely. We begin somewhat disordered, but then when we go to school and we learn about business and we learn about the ways of the world, we just fall even more deeply. So I think Augustine really has a beautiful sense that neither, right, on our own, and then the way that the culture misshapes us. And the irony is, I think many people have a sense for, at least today, the way that that we're somehow caught within something that we can't quite get out of.
Right. And
I think Augustine had a great sense for that.
Well, that's a good way of putting it. The sense of being trapped. That suffuses the early books of the Confessions. Both as a young man there, in his studies, and then later when he goes off to Carthage in Book 3 for an education, he gets trapped in what he calls Manichean birdlime.
The
sense of being adrift and not knowing how to get out.
Yeah, and even that sense of the Manichees, that it's not just being spiritual isn't intrinsically good. Being religious isn't intrinsically good. It can be even harder if you end up adopting a false religion, right? That's going to, so what are a couple, maybe just, in brief, a couple things that lead him out of that trap, right? And home ultimately, to the Catholic faith.
Well, Augustine was ripe picking for the Manicheans, right? He's young, bright, eager for truth, desperate for truth.
Yeah.
And they constantly hold out that they have some kind of secret teaching that they're going to relate to him. And so when he's a student in Carthage, very precocious young man, he's really on his way, he gets stuck with them, right? And he describes it, like I said, as being kind of trapped in birdlime. For 9 long years, he was with them. And getting out, extricating himself from that was a very difficult process, and really it's the workings of grace. But the secondary causes through which this worked, God's liberating effects, are his encounter with Ambrose, right? The great preacher from Milan. Augustine tells us that he went to go hear Ambrose preach. Right here is Augustine, a budding rhetor. Ambrose is known as a consummate rhetorician. Perhaps he sees a certain kinship, admiration certainly for Ambrose. So he goes to the cathedral and hears him preach. And he says he was blown away, not just by how he spoke, but by what he said, right? And that kind of, I think, gripped Augustine and made him rethink much of what the Manicheans had told him about the Catholic faith, that it was superstitious, simple, that it imagined God to be consigned to a body, right? That the creation was the result of an evil demiurge, that our redemption is really God taking us out of the physical cosmos up to this luminous spiritual realm. Ambrose taught Augustine to see the world, we could say, in a participatory way, right? That
Say more. What does participation mean there?
Well, that the realm of spirit, or in the Manichean terms, light, is very much related to this order, that the good God created it, that he's present in it, animating it, filling it with his own life and being. And he doesn't intend to pull us up out of and away from this world, but to redeem us in it and through it, that God himself took on a body. And it continues in the sacramental economy to extend himself in corporeal, physical, tangible, tactile means. Right? And
so you kind of avoid this dualism of spirit and matter, or of kind of somehow a good God and a bad God, these sorts of false views of the Manichees too. The idea that God as the good creator created us, both spirit and matter.
Precisely.
And therefore, if our spirit and matter fall, then God redeems us, right, by becoming incarnate and then recreating us, right?
And so Ambrose allowed Augustine to see the kind of intellectual truth that this made sense. Surely Ambrose availed himself of what Augustine was familiar with, some of the kind of Platonic texts, which also have this type of participatory vision of reality. People like Dauphinais, where Augustine was in Milan with Ambrose. There was a whole kind of, we could say, a study circle of Christian Platonists. And these allowed Augustine to think differently about the created order, and again, the goodness of the material order, and that it's precisely in matter that God communicates spiritual truth.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And it is, I always think it's fascinating that Augustine, in some ways in Book 7, has an intellectual conversion where he begins to be able to see that his understanding of God as somehow kind of this luminous material, like I want to put like this material light suffusing the universe, was really false, and that God actually is just being itself, who communicates to all things being. So whatever being they have, they receive from God. He comes up with this understanding to be able to believe that God is the creator. And this intellectual conversion is both necessary and not enough. And I think that says so much about really us, is that we have to have some sense that our intellects have to change their understanding of the world and of God in order for us to convert. Right? We have to. We can't believe in something in a way that if we think it is false. Right? So we need to have this intellectual conversion, this conversion. But the intellectual conversion is not enough. So we're not going to. I want to shift into some other stuff. But could you just maybe say a word or two about Augustine's, how it deepens into a moral conversion and his understanding of the need for grace?
Sure. Well, you mentioned Book 7, Augustine's intellectual conversion. That's exactly right. It's especially a new understanding about the nature of God as a spiritual being who's yet present to all things. And then also coming to terms with the nature of evil. That evil is, in fact, not some kind of perennial reality, thick ontological reality that's at war with God, but a lack of being, a privation of being, a privation of the good. But exactly as you say, that's not quite sufficient. Coming to see the truth of the Christian faith, being led, we could say, to the very doorsteps of the church, is not yet to enter into the church. Right? And book 8 is the moral conversion. And it's such a study in contrast, those two books, book 7 and book 8. Book 7 is very much, it's introspective, it's isolated, it's Augustine's own intellectual conversion. Plotinus speaks of the ascent of the alone to the alone. Book 8 is very different, right? Book 8 is rife with other people, right? All these other examples of conversion. So Augustine's story of his own moral conversion is nested like one of those Russian dolls in the story of multiple other conversions. Victorinus, Anthony of the Desert, the Courtiers of Trier, many others. Stories of other people who've tried to live the moral life and by grace can do so. Right? And so that's the story of the saints, isn't it? These kind of exempla that we can look up to and say, no, grace really does change the human person. And that's really what leads to the climactic scene there of Augustine's moral conversion, right? When the personified Lady Continence hold out her hands, right? And points to all these other exempla, young men, young women, boys and girls, old men and old women, all of those who've been able to live a new life by grace. So I think that's a wonderful study in contrast, book 7 and book 8.
Oh, well, that's so well put. Let's take a break, and when we come back, let's dive into a couple other big themes within Augustine, and maybe a couple of other of his works as well. I do want to ask a little bit about his understanding of original sin and how he felt like this was really necessary to actually maintain the good news of the gospel.
Sure.
So look forward to talking about that with you. Thank you.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. If you'd like to support our mission, we invite you to prayerfully consider joining our Annunciation Circle, a monthly giving program aimed at supporting our staff, faculty, and Catholic faith formation. You can visit us at avemaria.edu to learn more. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
Welcome back to the Catholic Theology Show. Today we have Dr. Gerald Boersma, a professor of theology at Ave Maria University, and we're discussing Augustine. And Dr. Boersma teaches a class on Augustine and has written on Augustine many different publications. So we're just just really enjoying this opportunity to learn more about really one of the great saints and teachers of the faith. And so I raised this question that I think Augustine is somewhat known for as helping us to see the doctrine of original sin. And so maybe you could say a little bit about how did he come about articulating this, right? It doesn't begin with him, but how does he come about articulating this reality? And maybe tell us a little bit about, right, Augustine's not just thinking of these things on his own, right? He's in the midst of there are a lot of controversies going on during his day. Could you say a word about that?
Yeah. Well, original sin, I think the first thing to say is not a very popular opinion today. Right?
Yes.
We don't usually think about a newborn baby, for example, as anything wrong, right? They come to the world innocent.
Yes.
And then later, perhaps they're corrupted.
Yes.
They hear their brothers fighting or the parents arguing. Someone pushes them on the playground. They think that's how I have to respond. But initially, no. Right? Well, Augustine says, no, it goes back before that. Right?
Yeah.
He takes very literally Psalm 51, in sin did my mother conceive me.
Yeah.
Right? So at the moment of conception, something goes awry. And it goes awry with us as rational beings. That is to say, in our intellect and our will.
Yeah.
Our intellect and will are fundamentally, there's a disorder there, right? They don't incline to truth perfectly or to the highest good perfectly.
Yeah.
Right? We're often confused about what's true, and we often love lower goods rather than the highest good. And so part of conversion, of the new life of grace, is having a reorientation of our intellects and our will.
Yeah.
Right? And Augustine's Confessions is really a story of that. And that's why the Confessions was so controversial.
Okay.
When it came out. One of the early readers, Pelagius, he read this and thought, oh no, this is hopelessly fatalistic. Right? That we are born with some kind of problem, deep-seated problem with our intellect and will, well, then no one will ever strive for the virtuous life. Right? Pelagius, he read the Confessions and said, well, no, if our Lord says be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect, surely that must be possible. God would not command us to do something of which we're incapable.
Yeah.
Right? Well, Augustine would agree, but it's really grace that makes us capable.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so it's the confessions that set off the firestorm that later became known as the Pelagian Controversy. Right? And Pelagius, Julian of Eclanum, and his associates thought, first of all, no, that original sin, again, is a fatalistic doctrine, that we kind of have not so much a fallen will, but bad examples. And so we have to turn to the good example, which is Christ.
Yes.
That remains extrinsic Christ. We have to look to him as a model, follow him, and then we can be converted.
Yeah.
Augustine's account of grace is much more inside.
Yeah.
It's inward.
Mm-hmm.
It's really deep within our knowing and loving that are turned around.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Augustine puts his finger on, because up until now, it might be, people might be thinking, maybe Pelagianism isn't so bad, but ultimately is that if we could follow a good example, why did Jesus have to die on the cross?
Yeah.
Right? Why did the Word have to become incarnate and then have to die? Somehow, why is the death of Christ, the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, how does that become the means of our redemption, of our salvation? And that's an indication that merely a good example would not be enough. There's something in our very will that needs to be kind of sacrificed on the cross and then reborn in the resurrection.
Right. And when he's reading the Confessions, Pelagius, and he's thinking about this, and Augustine's line in there that really vexed him is, "Command what you will and will what you command," in terms of our moral change. What Augustine insists on is the priority of grace. Right? That grace comes before we seek God, he seeks us. As Paul says, right? While we were enemies of God, Christ loved us and died for us.
Yeah.
And so grace has to come before and change us, grab our hearts, elicit our desires, turn them to be towards him himself. And then grace walks with us, accompanies with us. So it's never something that, I've been changed and now I'm doing it. No, grace comes along.
Yeah.
And even at the end, if by the grace of God we merit some type of reward, Augustine would say, his immortal words, merit is God crowning his own gifts.
Yeah, right.
Merit is God crowning his own gifts. So prevenient, accompanying, and perfective grace, there's nothing of which, when I come to the pearly gates, I can pat myself on my back. Where's my crown? No, it's always a gift. And the giftedness of existence, of nature, and of grace is, I think, the place to start when thinking about Augustine's theology of grace.
That is so beautiful. And I think in some ways, Augustine's kind of his nick. I don't know if it's official name. Is it official? The Doctor of Grace.
That's right. Yeah.
I think that's how he's known certainly in the Middle Ages and in continuing in the Church. The Doctor of Grace. That we understand salvation. Right? Is that it's not just that salvation is a gift, but everything is a gift from God. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts about this. So it seems to me there's two things at work here in his understanding of original sin. Partly, what he's getting at is that there's a fundamental flaw in us and in the whole world that's it's all ultimately when we recognize that original sin, that original wound, that original off balance. And we kind of begin to recognize, no wonder all of our attempts my attempts at virtue, my attempts at having a good family, my attempts at trying to organize a society, all of our attempts always fail. It's kind of a relief to recognize that, we are, it's kind of like your car, when you finally realize your car's out of alignment. It's kind of great because, but Augustine never adopts that view apart from the good news of Jesus Christ.
Precisely.
So it's never kind of saying, your car's out of alignment. Sorry, it's your car's out of alignment and I can fix it. Yeah. Your will's out of alignment. It's curved in on itself, as he described. It's incurvatus in se. Right. We're made to look at God and to kind of wonder at the beauty of others and even the beauty of our own creation. But instead we turn in on ourselves and see my own ego at the center of the world. And right, so you're never separating, in a certain sense, the diagnosis from the cure.
Right.
And
Right.
the catechism. Oh
No, please.
I would say the catechism has that idea that right, original sin is just the reverse side of the good news of Jesus Christ. Like, it's when we hear the gospel, it's almost like that's when we realize, oh, I needed to be redeemed. Oh, no wonder life has been so hard.
And this is why he thought, Pelagius was putting a stake in the heart of the gospel.
Mm,
right? And when you first hear Pelagius preach, and he was a great preacher, he sounds very, very hopeful, very optimistic, right? And it was precisely this kind of buoyant optimism that I think attracted him as a preacher. He would appeal to kind of people's better instincts, kind of like a coach of elite athletes, trying to live up to their full potential. Right? The kind of native reserves of moral greatness that lie deep within. He was trying to pull that out. Right? And he thought, well, Augustine's teaching on original sin, that's destructive of people's effort. But exactly as you say, that's not the case. Because Pelagius wasn't giving an accurate account of our existence after the fall. Right? That again, the moral life, our lives with ourselves, each other, our family, society, there's always a bug in the system.
And it's fundamentally pride, right? In some part, it's that pride that I take myself as the center of the universe instead of receiving everything from God. So that's really, so there's sometimes I think when people set up or when people talk about Augustine, they'll talk about kind of his early controversy with the Manicheans, in which he kind of defends the goodness of creation and the wisdom of revelation, right? The goodness of God who overcomes evil, and then maybe you talked about it, the later controversy with Pelagius, and this sense of kind of yes, creation is good, but it's not that good, right? We need grace. Don't forget the element that Jesus had to die on the cross and send His Spirit so that we could have new life. There's another big controversy for which he's known, right, with the Donatists.
Sure.
So would you say a little bit about that, and maybe how do you kind of introduce that into your course?
Yeah. Well, controversy is the right word, and Augustine was a controversialist, right? He was a pugnacious type of person, right? He is a type that did his best thinking in the fires of controversy. That's where he forged his real thinking.
Yeah.
And that's, you kind of sometimes think about maybe some more pacific medieval theologians. Augustine does not write in that world, right? So you mentioned the Manicheans initially. Yes, upon his conversion, the first, I would say, decade in which he's doing serious writing, it's always against the Manicheans. Consider that he writes 5 times on the first 2 chapters of Genesis, affirming the goodness of the created order, that God is present in it, animating it, that it becomes the vehicle of our redemption.
The goodness of the church is part of that too.
The unity of the Old New Testament. Right? All this is forged against the Manicheans. Later, he comes back to Africa, and that's really where he comes upon a scene that's already quite old in Africa, namely the Donatist controversy. Right? The Donatists were a sectarian group in North Africa, but in many places the majority in North Africa. Right? So if you went into every large town, there would be 2 cathedrals, a Donatist cathedral and a Catholic cathedral. Right? Donatist bishop and a Catholic bishop. They were more powerful perhaps in the kind of remote areas, and the major cities, which were under strong Roman presence, would be more Catholic. But it appealed to kind of the rebellious spirit, you might say, of African sensibilities. They called the Catholic Church the Church transmare, the church over the seas, which is always being kind of controlled by imperial forces. Right? And Augustine, having spent so much time in Italy, saw that no, for the church to be Catholic, to be universal of the whole, it couldn't simply be in Africa, right? And so somehow the African church would have to be in communion with the rest of the world. So he comes back with that, we could say, more universal vision of the church. And immediately he's thrown into the controversies in North Africa. And so much of the 35 years that he spends in North Africa is responding to the Donatists. He does so through public debates, through writings, through letters, in fact, teaching rhyming poems to his congregants.
Oh, wow.
But both through, we could say, carrot and stick. He attempted to convince the Donatists of Catholic claims of the necessity of the universal church.
Okay. So really beginning with the need for the Catholic meaning universal.
Right. And that really inflected itself in two ways, both Augustine's sacramental theology and his theology of the church, his ecclesiology.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. So in terms of the sacraments, the Donatists held that only their particular little conventicles had authentic sacraments. Right? All others were invalid. Right? And part of this really goes back to the legacy of how Donatism came to be. Right? At the end of the Diocletian persecutions, some Catholic bishops had handed over the sacred items, the sacred books, sacred vessels, and these became known as traditores, from handing over.
Traitors, right?
Traitors, literally, right? After the kind of dust settled, persecutions ended, some of these, including bishops, wanted their positions back. They'd handed on the sacred items. Now they said, we want to be bishops again. Others said, no, you're out now. In fact, if you want to come back in, you have to be rebaptized and reordained. Right? And so that became the Donatist position, right? Rebaptism before you can have all the other sacraments. The Catholics, already before Augustine, held no, baptism has an indelible mark on the soul. You're forever baptized. What you need to do is convert, do penance, enter back into a regular sacramental life of the church. But this became, I would say, a fault line in North Africa. Both sides appealing to the great African bishop Cyprian. And so that's one thing that Augustine does when he comes back to Africa, is he appeals especially to Cyprian and the older African theology in emphasizing that baptism is a once-for-all thing. Right? You're forever part of the church. He would often avail himself of the image of Roman soldiers who deserted. When they came back, what they would look for is whether they had the pignus, the kind of tattoo, the stamp on their right hand. If they did, they were still members of the Roman army. They didn't have to be rebranded, you could say.
Okay.
So too, with those who have fallen away from the church.
And this really then gets expressed in the teaching of the church that the sacraments work, right, ex opere operato, right, from the work having been worked. They work from the nature of the sacraments, which was ultimately the promise of Christ, because it's the power of Christ in the sacraments. Right. And I think all of us have a kind of a native sympathy for wanting holy priests, holy bishops, right? It would be more fun to go to Mass with a saint than to go to, or a dynamic preacher, than to go to Mass with a, lukewarm priest, right? All these things are true in some ways. And yet, on the other hand, if we think that it's the priest who happens to be more dynamic or perhaps holier, that it's the priest who's confecting the Eucharist, we're really confused, right? And I think Augustine really put his finger on that it's Christ who baptizes, right? It's Christ who celebrates the Eucharist, and it would really be very hard for us to figure out who baptized us. Did they ever sin? When did they sin? Did they sin later? How do we know how holy they were?
Right. And this kind of succession, these lines of holiness, were so important to the Donatists.
Yeah.
A little aside here, when you think about Augustine telling his own story of baptism, right, in the Confessions, you might think he'd introduce it with trumpets, because that's kind of the high water mark of the Confessions. But he says it, in one Latin word: we were baptized. Right? He doesn't go into it much. And you might say, why? Well, I think he doesn't want to play to the Donatists. He was, of course, baptized by a very famous, very holy bishop, Ambrose.
Yes.
But he doesn't even mention that. Right? He just says, we were baptized.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great example of Augustine's insistence, precisely as you say, that it's not the holiness of the minister that constitutes the validity of the sacrament, but it's Christ who works through these instruments.
Yeah. Could you just say a little bit about, tell us a little bit about your own story? How did you get interested in reading Augustine? How did you get interested in studying theology? Or you're a convert to the Catholic Church? Maybe, in a couple minutes, could you tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, I grew up in a wonderful Christian family in which theology was very important. My dad is a theologian, so I think I came by it honestly.
Yeah, a wonderful theologian who's written a lot of great books on the fathers.
He has,
and their kind of love of liturgy, love of Scripture.
Yeah,
right.
And so I studied theology as an undergraduate. I took a number of theology classes from a local Catholic college, which deeply informed me and wanted me, kind of compelled me, I think, to want to think more about studying theology. I took some time teaching and then decided, no, I'm going to go on for graduate studies, and actually came to Ave Maria University to do a master's in theology. And I wrote my thesis on a 20th century theologian by the name of Henri de Lubac. And particularly I was interested in his theology of the church, right, on the unity of the church. And as I was reading through de Lubac's corpus, I noticed Augustine is everywhere.
Yeah.
And I was speaking with my I'll never forget this, speaking with my director, Professor Matthew Levering, who many of you know.
Yes.
Wonderful person. He said, well, maybe you should just go right to the source. Do a PhD on Augustine. And I thought, well, maybe I'll do that. And he put me in contact with various Augustine people, and I ended up going to the University of Durham in England to study Augustine with Professor Lewis Ayres there. And so that's kind of my introduction, you could say, to scholarly life of Augustine.
Yeah, and what was now you were with more Reformed tradition in which you were raised, and you...
That's right, yeah. I grew up in a Dutch Reformed family, wonderful community, and I would say quite a long period of kind of discernment. In 2008, I was received into the Catholic Church.
Okay, well, that's anyway, very, very beautiful, and thank you for sharing that with us. So, just imagine your students 5 years down the road, right? They've taken your class. Maybe they're lawyers. Maybe they're working in a bank. Maybe they're homemakers. I don't know. Maybe they're running podcasts. YouTubers or whatever people are doing these days. What are things that maybe what are I don't know, 2, 3, or 4 things that you want them to carry with them,
right?
That they would remember about Augustine from your course.
Yeah, well, again, to kind of circle back, I think, Augustine is one of these towering figures. And that really is an understatement. He kind of defines, we could say, Western Catholic theology as kind of giving definitive systematic shape to what the Apostle Paul and the rest of Scripture speak about. And one way I think that's helpful to kind of present that is through Augustine's Controversies. So we've spoken a bit about his theology of creation, of the goodness of creation, the same God who makes matter, redeems matter, reforms us, also reforms us. His theology of the church, right? Some we've spoken about here. His theology of sacraments, the necessity of the unity of the church. His theology of the Holy Eucharist, right? Again, he gets that very much through his controversy of the Donatists. And the last controversy that really marked Augustine, and therefore also marked Western theological tradition, is his debates with the Pelagians, right? On the primacy of grace, right? And so I would think those kind of 3 things: his theology of grace, his theology of the sacraments in the church, and his theology of creation. I mean, you could spend a lifetime there, and I intend to.
No, that's really beautifully put. Let's maybe just kind of as we begin to close, I'd love to just kind of ask you 3 other just kind of maybe more personal questions.
Sure.
What's a book you've been reading lately?
A book I've been reading lately. That's a good question. I've actually been working a lot on something in St. Thomas. And St. Thomas is very much an heir of Augustine, and it's on Aquinas's way of knowing by way of connaturality, by affectivity, by way of experience. And I think in this way, Aquinas is very much in the legacy of Augustine. So
no, that's excellent to hear. I think it is. I think there's kind of a caricature that Augustine has kind of one approach to theology, and Thomas sometimes has another. And that's always struck me as profoundly wrong. We did a conference a number of years ago here at Ave with the Aquinas Center for Theological Renewal called Aquinas the Augustinian.
Oh, good, yeah.
And tried to show that, right, I mean, if you look within his quotes after Scripture, right, Augustine, is the most quoted. It shows up throughout his biblical commentaries, shows up throughout his Sacred Doctrina. And I really think in some ways, this might be a little bit... I don't know, maybe this is provocative, but I think that because Augustine wrote in controversial terms, he expressed doctrines in the heat of the debate. He was often, I mean, in some ways, his culture was a little bit like ours. It was profound. It was pluralistic. It was secular. It was hostile. There was kind of a thriving, somewhat anti-Christian but non-Christian way of thinking, and all this sort of stuff. So he's in the midst of all these things. The church, as it's responding, also has a lot of there's different divisions within it. The Donatists, all these different elements, and so I think there's also an ability sometimes, if you just took Augustine on his own, that you could, you could eventually you could get confused because it's so big. I mean, it's funny, St. Peter, and I think it's second Peter, right, says that Paul writes so much that people read Paul and get confused, right? And so they need to read it with the church. Well, in some ways, I think that Aquinas kind of is reading Augustine, right, with the wisdom of the church.
That's well put.
I
very much agree.
And I think that's a really beautiful element. It's been great to see you both be a consummate Augustine scholar and now developing as a scholar of St. Thomas as well, which is great. And you have an upcoming, what are you're going, I think, you have a scholar, what is it, a fellowship in Germany to study?
This fall, I'll be going to the University of Tübingen. And continuing some work on St. Thomas. So it's an exciting time.
No, that's really wonderful. So second question, what's what's one of a daily practice that you carry out to kind of draw closer to God?
Well, I would say particularly with Augustine. One thing I try to do daily, and in a spiritual level, is take Augustine to prayer. I think the Confessions is a prayer, and so you can read it as such. So just reading, a little paragraph, prayerfully, intentionally, in a style of kind of Alexio Divina, has been a great profit to me. So Augustine is one of those saints you can easily pray with.
That's beautifully put. And last question. What's a view that you held about God that you discovered to be false? And what was the truth you discovered?
That's a very good question. I would say what Augustine has helped me to see, and I don't think I see it perfectly yet, is the way in which we have to affirm, in fact, I know I don't see that perfectly yet, the way in which we have to affirm God's radical nearness, his immanence, his proximity to all things, and at the same time his radical transcendence, and his holy other. That he's not a being in the world, right? But simply, as you mentioned before, being itself. And Augustine's vision of the divine presence as immanent on the one hand and wholly transcendent on the other is in many ways the story of his conversion, but it's something that I would say, in my ongoing conversion, trying to discern and affirm both sides of that as best we can.
That's great. One of the professors who founded the graduate program in theology here, Father Matthew Lamb, I don't know if he was a wonderful lover of St. Thomas and St. Augustine, but I don't know if he ever gave a homily, which at some point he didn't try to draw on that Augustinian theme of God's immanent presence and also transcendence, but he would always say, in whom, quoting Paul, but in the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And it kind of is, it's just a radically, we want to somehow think God as another, somehow not in me or somehow another thing in the world. And it is such a powerful way of understanding that God is really at the heart of all existence. Well, thank you so much, Gerald, for being on the show. For listeners who are interested in learning more about Augustine, I would encourage you to listen to a earlier episode with Dr. John Cavadini, in which we focus exclusively on the Confessions. And also, hopefully, we'll be able to have Dr. Boersma again and maybe do a deep dive into some of Augustine's specific works.
That would be a delight.
Excellent.
Well,
thank you so much
for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for this podcast. If you like this episode, please rate and review it on your favorite podcast app to help others find the show. And if you want to take the next step, please consider joining our Annunciation Circle so we can continue to bring you more free content. We'll see you next time on the Catholic Theology Show.